The Gargoyle King. Written by King Edward. Copyright 09/14/2025. Chapter 1. The Lonely Prince. Prince Edward's childhood was a study in silence. The castle's stone walls, so grand and imposing, did little to muffle the emptiness of its halls. His father, the king, was a man carved from the same hard material as the castle itself. A stoic figure of state and strategy, he saw his son not as a child, but as an heir, a duty, a burden, a political tool. Edward learned the names of foreign kings and the dates of great battles, but he never learned the warmth of a father's embrace. He grew up with only the whispers of servants and the echoes of his own footsteps for company. The castle was a labyrinth of cold, polished marble and dark embroidered hangings. Edward spent his days in the royal library, a vast, echoing room where dust motes danced in the lone shafts of sunlight. He read of heroes and villains, of epic quests and star-crossed lovers, using the books as windows into a world he could only dream of. The other noble children, those who were allowed to visit the court with their parents, found him strange and aloof. He was the prince, a figure of awe and fear, but they kept their distance, unable to connect with a boy who seemed more comfortable with a stack of old books than with a wooden sword. Even the servants, though kind, treated him with a reserved formality, their faces polite masks hiding their true thoughts. They would lay out his clothes, serve his meals, and tend to his needs with a quiet efficiency that made him feel more like an object to be cared for than a person to be known. His most painful memory was a small wooden horse he had carved himself, a labor of love that had taken weeks. Edward had spent countless hours in the castle's workshop, a cold, forgotten room where old tools lay rusting in the corners. He had a small knife, barely more than a blade, and he had painstakingly chipped away at a block of aged oak. He imagined a great war horse for his father, a symbol of strength and power, a tribute from a son who longed to be seen. He had even used a tiny, delicate wire to craft a mane and tail, and his fingers ached for days from the effort. He had believed that this small gift, a tangible piece of his heart and his labor, would finally bridge the chasm between them. He had presented it to his father, a rare moment of youthful courage. The king had glanced at it for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, before handing it to a nearby guard. "A fine carving," he'd said in a tone that lacked all warmth. "Now, to your tutors. Your lessons on military formations are more important than such distractions." The horse was never seen again, and Edward learned that his efforts to win his father's affection were in vain. He retreated further into himself, finding solace only in the fantasy worlds of his books. His one true source of solace was Kevin, a sage whose immense, frightening power was whispered of in the same breath as ancient demons. The people feared Kevin, not just for his rumored magic, but for his solitary existence and the strange creatures that were said to serve him. Kevin's cottage sat on the edge of the kingdom, a small, unassuming hut that seemed to defy the elements. To most, it was a place to be avoided, a source of dark legends. But to Edward, it was the only place that felt like home. Edward had first met Kevin on a day when the weight of his loneliness had become unbearable. He had snuck past the guards, his heart pounding in his chest, and followed a long-forgotten servant's path out of the castle grounds. He had not planned where he was going, only that he needed to be away. He found himself at a crossroads, lost and afraid, when a deep, rumbling voice broke the silence. "The road to the north leads to town, little prince," the voice had said. "But the road to the east leads to truth." Edward had turned to see a giant of a man, his face weathered like a mountain and his eyes as ancient as the stars. It was Kevin, the feared sage. But there was no malice in his eyes, only a profound sadness and an understanding that pierced Edward's carefully constructed walls. Kevin saw beyond the loneliness in the prince's eyes and decided to take it upon himself to teach him. He brought Edward to his cottage and offered him a bowl of steaming soup, the first truly comforting thing he had tasted in years. Kevin's lessons were unlike any Edward had received from his royal tutors. While they drilled him on military history and trade laws, Kevin taught him to find the subtle language of the natural world. He would take the boy on long walks in the forest, pointing out how the smallest sapling fought to find sunlight and how the oldest trees shared nutrients through a hidden network of roots. "A kingdom, my boy," Kevin would say, his voice like the low rumble of a landslide, "is no different from a forest. A good king ensures all his people can reach for the light, and he never forgets the roots that support him." He taught Edward to listen, not just to words, but to the unspoken fears of the people. They would visit the small villages on the kingdom's outskirts, where Kevin, despite his reputation, was revered for his wisdom. Edward learned to see the worry in a farmer's eyes over a coming drought, to hear the quiet desperation of a mother whose child was ill. These were the lessons that truly mattered. Kevin showed him that true power lay in kindness, not in force. A king does not command by birthright alone, my boy, Kevin would say, his voice a soft rumbling sound. He commands by heart. A leader must have compassion for even the smallest worm in the dirt. Under Kevin's gentle guidance, Edward began to shed the shell of his loneliness and grow into a young man of profound wisdom and compassion. He was still a prince, bound by duty, but he was also something more, a leader in his heart, a king in training who cared deeply for his future subjects. The years passed in this manner, Edward spending his days in the sterile, lonely halls of the castle and his nights under the guidance of the wise sage, finding strength and purpose in the balance of his two worlds. He had a secret identity, a life no one in the court knew about, and for the first time, he felt truly alive. Chapter 2: The Sage's Request. The morning sun, still weak and timid, cast long, hazy shadows across the cobbled courtyard as Edward prepared for his quest. Kevin had asked him to fetch a specific type of grape, a deep purple variety that grew only in the fertile, sun-drenched vineyards of the Western Valley. It was a simple task, a chore that any commoner's child might be sent on, yet for Edward, it felt like an adventure. It was a rare opportunity to leave the castle walls and experience the world beyond his gilded cage, and a chance to prove his worth to the man who had shown him more kindness than his own father. He had donned a simple tunic and worn leather trousers, the kind of clothing a squire or a merchant's son might wear, and a soft leather satchel was slung over his shoulder. The guards at the gate, accustomed to his strange comings and goings, gave him a respectful but wary nod. Their eyes, though trained to be impassive, held a mixture of curiosity and unease. They knew he spent time with the feared sage, and that knowledge was a quiet shield that kept them from questioning his motives. Edward walked with a lightness in his step he rarely felt within the castle. The air was crisp and smelled of damp earth and distant wood smoke. The birds chirped their morning songs, a cheerful chorus that was a stark contrast to the sterile silence of his chambers. The path to the Western Valley was a familiar one to him, a route he had taken with Kevin on their lessons. After a few hours of walking, the manicured paths gave way to a wilder landscape. The gentle hills became steeper, and the trees grew taller and more gnarled. This was the fringe of the Whispering Woods, a place of folklore and old tales that the common people avoided. It was here, where the world of man began to fade and the world of nature held sway, that Edward found the ruins. He had passed them before, of course, but always with Kevin, who had never lingered. Today, with no one to guide him, his curiosity got the better of him. He veered off the main path, his footsteps rustling through a carpet of dry leaves. The air grew still, and the joyful songs of the birds ceased. The ruins were ancient, swallowed by time and a thick blanket of moss and ivy. Crumbling stone arches, once the grand entrance to some forgotten place, stood like skeletal giants in the gloom. The ground was littered with broken pillars and the husks of statues, their faces worn away by 1,000 years of wind and rain. Edward pushed a branch aside and found himself in a clearing where a large, circular stone fountain lay in pieces, its basin cracked and filled with a thick, stagnant green water. Two large stone figures, one a male and the other a female, stood on either side, their features so eroded they looked more like naturally occurring rock formations than the work of a craftsman. He felt a strange pull to the place, an almost supernatural sense of recognition that he could not explain. He ran his hand over the smooth, moss-covered stone of one of the figures, and a shiver ran down his spine, a sense of an old, deep energy sleeping beneath the surface. He felt as though he was standing in a place of great significance, a place that held the secret to a time long before his own. He was about to explore further when a sharp, unpleasant scent reached his nose, the smell of damp dog and rotting meat. It was the scent of a goblin. Edward's heart, which had been racing with a sense of wonder, now pounded with adrenaline. Kevin had taught him about the creatures of the woods and the dangers they posed. Goblins were small but vicious, their minds warped by greed and malice. He drew his small, well-worn dagger, the only protection he carried. The sound of a footstep in the underbrush, a snapping twig, confirmed his fears. He backed into the shadow of a crumbling wall, his senses on high alert. A small, hunched figure emerged from the trees. It was a goblin, its skin a sickly green, its eyes two beads of pure malevolence. Its arms were long and spindly, its hands ending in claws, and its body was covered in a filthy tattered hide. It held a rusty, chipped axe that looked as though it had been used to chop more than just wood. The creature sniffed the air, its snout twitching, its beady eyes scanning the clearing. It had not seen him yet. Edward, remembering Kevin's lessons on stealth, held his breath and remained as still as a statue. He had been taught that with smaller, lesser creatures, a clever mind was a more potent weapon than brute strength. The goblin, a creature of pure instinct, was distracted by a small, shiny pebble in the dirt. It crouched, its long fingers scrabbling for the stone, its low guttural grunts a strange soundtrack to the eerie silence of the ruins. This was his chance. Edward crept from his hiding spot, his movements as silent as a falling leaf. He moved around the perimeter, using the broken pillars and fallen stones as cover. He was close now, barely a dozen paces from the oblivious creature. He lunged forward, not with a shout of aggression, but with a silent, determined fury. He had learned from Kevin that a direct attack on a goblin could lead to a drawn-out, messy fight. Instead, he struck at its weapon arm, hoping to disarm it. The goblin shrieked as the blade sliced across its forearm, a high, thin sound that grated on the ears. It dropped its axe with a clatter and whipped around, its eyes now fixed on him, filled with a primal, homicidal rage. The creature lunged, its claws extended. Edward, nimble and quick, dodged the attack, spinning away from the goblin's grasp. He had trained tirelessly with Kevin, his mentor teaching him the art of deflection and counter-attack. The goblin was faster than he expected, its movements jerky and unpredictable. It snapped its teeth at his face, a disgusting, wet sound. Edward ducked and thrust his dagger into its side. The blade, meant for a prince's practice, was too dull to do much damage. The goblin grunted in annoyance rather than pain and swiped at him again. This time, its claws raked across Edward's chest, tearing his tunic and leaving 3 long, stinging welts on his skin. A bead of his blood, bright against the torn fabric, caught the goblin's attention. Its eyes widened, and a low, hungry growl rumbled in its chest. The creature forgot its axe, its primal mind now focused on the scent of blood. It came at him, a relentless wave of claws and teeth. This was no longer a simple test of skill. This was a fight for his life. Edward dodged and weaved, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was bleeding, and the fear was a cold knot in his stomach. But a voice in his head, Kevin's voice, reminded him of his lessons. "Never fight their fight, my boy," the voice seemed to say. "Make them fight yours." The goblin was too fast for his blade to land a decisive blow. He had to create an opening, to use the environment to his advantage. He remembered a crumbling pillar just behind the goblin. He feinted to the left, drawing the goblin's attention, and then darted to the right, a quick burst of motion. The goblin, overconfident, lunged after him, its feet skidding on the loose stones of the ruined fountain. It stumbled, its back to the crumbling pillar. This was his moment. With a grunt of pure effort, Edward shoved the pillar with both hands. The ancient stone, weakened by centuries of decay, groaned and tilted. The goblin, distracted by its attempt to regain its balance, looked up just in time to see the immense weight of the pillar come crashing down upon it. The sound was a sickening crunch of bone and stone, followed by a final, high-pitched squeal that was cut short by a dull thud. The air, which had been thick with the stench of the goblin's body, now held a new smell, the metallic scent of blood. Edward stood over the flattened corpse, his chest heaving, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and triumph. He walked over to the grotesque scene, his heart still thrumming in his ears. The goblin's head was a mangled mess, but one of its ears, long and pointed, had been cleanly severed by the impact. Edward, his hands still shaking, picked it up. He remembered Kevin's half-joking words from a previous lesson, "If you ever truly wish to impress me, do not just tell me of your battles. Show me. Bring me the ear of your opponent, and I will believe you." The words had been spoken with a soft laugh, but Edward knew his mentor had been testing him. He took the ear, wrapping it in a piece of cloth from his satchel, a grotesque yet undeniable trophy. He continued his journey to the western valley, his pace a little faster, his senses a little sharper. The vineyards, when he reached them, were a welcome sight. Rows upon rows of vines laden with a deep, purple fruit that shimmered like polished amethyst in the afternoon sun. He filled his satchel, choosing only the most perfect, unblemished bunches. The air here was sweet with the scent of ripened fruit and the hum of bees, a peaceful balm to his rattled nerves. The walk back was uneventful. The forest seemed a little less threatening, and the world seemed a little more vibrant now that he had faced a true test. He returned to Kevin's cottage as dusk began to settle, the air growing cool. He found the sage sitting outside, his great form silhouetted against the setting sun. Kevin was holding a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a tiny masterpiece of a falcon in flight. He did not look up, but his deep voice rumbled. "You were gone a long time, my boy. The grapes are safe." "Yes, Master Kevin," Edward replied, his voice a little hoarse. He set the satchel down and then, with a hint of pride, he presented the small, cloth-wrapped object. "I found more than just grapes." Kevin's ancient eyes, as old as the mountains, looked from the satchel to the cloth. A slow smile, a rare and beautiful thing, spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Ah," he said, the word a soft rumbling sound. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal the goblin's ear. He held it for a moment, his gaze unreadable, before setting it gently down on a nearby stone. "A good fight, I imagine." "He was faster than I expected," Edward said, a little defensively. "And I bled." "Good," Kevin said, his gaze fixed on the goblin's ear. "A clean victory leaves you with a swelled head and a false sense of security. A hard-won victory leaves you with wisdom and humility. You used your mind to defeat him, not just your strength. That is the mark of a true leader." He looked up at Edward, his eyes filled with a profound sense of pride. "You are learning. You are becoming a king of men, not just a king of crowns." The praise, so simple and yet so meaningful, warmed Edward more than the soup had on the day they first met. He felt a deep sense of accomplishment, a knowledge that he had done something his father would never have understood. He had faced a monster and won, not with a royal army or a polished sword, but with his wits and the lessons of his mentor. As he and Kevin sat in comfortable silence, the last of the sun's light faded, and the first star of the evening emerged in the darkening sky. The goblin's ear lay on the stone, a small, ugly testament to the long, difficult path he had just taken. But in that moment, Edward felt a sense of peace. He had faced a fear and conquered it, and he was ready for whatever came next. Little did he know that the greatest test of all, a test that would change him forever, was just beginning. Chapter 3: The King's Death. The twilight air in the western valley was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant pine trees. The setting sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in a palette of deep purples and fiery oranges. Kevin's cottage, a humble structure of weathered stone and timber, was a solitary point of warmth in the darkening landscape. Thin wisps of smoke curled from its chimney, a quiet sign of the comfort within. Edward sat with Kevin on a pair of rough-hewn wooden stools, his heart still thrumming with the adrenaline of his encounter with the goblin. The goblin's ear, a grotesque yet strangely satisfying trophy, lay on the stone between them, a silent testament to his small but significant victory. Kevin's words of praise had settled deep within him, a balm to the years of his father's distant disdain. For the first time, Edward felt a profound sense of self-worth that was not tied to his title as a prince. He had faced a true test of character and skill, and he had passed. The knowledge that he had used his wits, not just a blade, to defeat the goblin was a source of immense pride. He looked at Kevin, his mentor's ancient face softened by the fading light, and felt a connection deeper than any he had ever known. This was the man who had shown him what it meant to be strong, not just in body, but in mind and spirit. Their peaceful moment, however, was shattered by the sound of a horse galloping up the winding path with a frantic, desperate energy. It was a jarring, unnatural noise in the serene stillness of the woods. A single rider, cloaked in the royal livery of the castle, dismounted with a tired grace. He was a young courier, his face pale with exertion and his eyes wide with a deep-seated fear. He bowed stiffly to Edward, his gaze flickering nervously to Kevin, who remained a still, silent presence. "My prince," the courier gasped, his voice thin and strained. "Forgive my intrusion, but the Queen, she sent me, a matter of utmost urgency." Edward's stomach clenched. A messenger sent directly from his mother was a rare thing, and the look of terror in the boy's eyes confirmed his worst fears. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low and steady despite the sudden surge of anxiety. "What has happened at the castle?" The courier swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he clutched a sealed scroll. "It is the king, your highness," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He has been struck with a mysterious illness. The royal physicians, they have exhausted all their remedies. They say he is not long for this world." Edward felt the world tilt on its axis. He had always known this day would come, of course. His father was an old man, and the cycle of a king's life was as inevitable as the changing of the seasons. But to hear it spoken aloud, with such dreadful certainty, was like a physical blow. The coldness and distance of his relationship with his father had not prepared him for the sudden, sharp pang of grief and dread that now pierced his heart. He looked at Kevin, whose expression remained impassive, his silence a great, comforting presence in the chaos of the moment. Kevin gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of quiet support. "Is there any explanation?" Edward asked, his voice shaking. "What kind of illness is it?" "A wasting sickness, your highness," the courier replied, his eyes filled with a helpless terror. It came on him without warning. One day, he was in the great hall, presiding over the court with his usual strength. The next, he could barely stand. He has been growing weaker by the hour. He has not eaten in 3 days, and his skin is translucent, like alabaster. It is as though he is fading from this world, losing his very substance. The courier shuddered, as if remembering a terrible sight. "The physicians believe it is a curse. A foreign curse, perhaps. There is no remedy for it in all of our texts." The word curse hung in the air, a dark cloud settling over their heads. It was a word that held an ancient, primal power in this land, a word that spoke of things that medicine and steel could not defeat. Edward's mind, trained by Kevin to think logically, dismissed the notion as a superstition. But his heart, so suddenly filled with a deep sense of dread, felt differently. The courier's words were a direct threat to the stability of the kingdom. With the king's health failing, the vultures of the court, the ambitious nobles and the jealous rivals, would begin to circle. "I must return to the castle immediately," Edward said, his voice now a low, commanding tone, the tone of a prince who had just been jolted into his destiny. He looked at Kevin, a silent plea in his eyes. Kevin rose, his great form a dark shadow against the pale light of the moon. "Go," he said, his voice a low, rumbling sound that was filled with a profound sense of farewell. "The time for your final lesson has come, my boy. A king's greatest challenge is not on the battlefield, but in the heart of his court. You must go and face the shadows of your own past, and those of your family." Edward felt a sudden, deep sadness. "Will I see you again, Master Kevin?" he asked, the words a desperate plea. He felt as though he was leaving the only true home he had ever known. "The road to truth is a long one, my boy," Kevin said with a rare, gentle smile. "I will be here. But you must walk the next path alone." The words were a quiet finality, a gentle push toward the inevitable. Edward gave the courier a nod and mounted his horse. The journey back to the castle was a blur of frantic energy and rising fear. The world, which had seemed so vibrant and alive just a few hours ago, now felt cold and menacing. He rode through the night, the moon a sliver of silver in the inky sky, its light seeming to mock his desperation. He passed familiar landmarks, the ancient, silent trees of the whispering woods, the distant lights of a shepherd's cottage, and they all seemed to belong to a past life, a childhood he was now leaving behind forever. He was no longer just the lonely prince seeking solace in books and the company of a sage. He was the heir, the future of a kingdom, and his father was dying. He arrived at the castle just as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. The morning light, so full of promise, felt like a terrible joke. The castle was awake, but not with the usual bustle of activity. There was a somber, fearful hush that hung in the air, a sense of quiet dread. The guards at the gate, their faces pale and drawn, saluted him with a new, sober respect that was chilling in its sincerity. He saw courtiers whispering in hushed tones in the great hall, their faces etched with anxiety. The kingdom was adrift, a ship without a rudder, and all eyes were now turning to him. He went directly to his father's chamber, the scent of death and decay, mingled with the cloying aroma of medicinal herbs, hitting him before he even opened the door. The king's chamber, once so grand and filled with the trappings of power, now felt like a crypt. His father, a man once known for his imposing figure and booming voice, was a frail, shrunken shadow of his former self. He lay propped up on a bed of silk and velvet, his skin so pale it was almost transparent, the bones of his face and hands sharp and pronounced. His eyes, though clouded with fever, still held a faint spark of the powerful will that had once commanded an army. He looked at Edward, and his eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful regret. "Edward," he whispered, his voice a dry, rasping sound. "You've come. I was beginning to fear you would not make it in time." Edward knelt by the bed, his heart aching with a mixture of sadness and pity. "I came as fast as I could, father," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The king's hand, a collection of frail bones and parchment-like skin, reached for his. Edward took it, and it felt as cold and hard as a stone. His father's grip, once so strong, was now weak and trembling. I have failed you, my son," the king rasped. "I was so focused on the kingdom, on the lineage. I forgot to be a father. Forgive me." The words, so long hoped for, so long despaired of, were like a blow to the chest. Edward wanted to tell him that it was all right, that he understood, but the words caught in his throat. He could only hold his father's hand, a silent sign of his forgiveness. "The kingdom is yours now," the king said, his voice growing weaker. "You must be strong. You must be a king of men, not a king of crowns. Your mother, she will need you. The court, they will test you." His breathing was shallow, his gaze distant. "You have learned more than I ever could from all my years of being a king. You have a heart. A king needs a heart, Edward, more than anything else." Edward looked at his father's face, and for the first time in his life, he saw not the distant, unyielding monarch, but a dying man, filled with a deep regret for a love he never gave. It was a terrible, tragic thing to witness, and in that moment, Edward felt the full, crushing weight of his new reality. He was a king now, and the great test of his life was about to begin. The future of the kingdom rested on his shoulders. He would have to face the court alone, without the guidance of Kevin and with only the memory of his father's final words to guide him. Chapter 4: The Path of the Ancestors. The sun, which had risen with a gentle, indifferent light, soon cast its full, unrelenting glare upon the kingdom. The funeral for the old king was a spectacle of calculated sorrow. The entire court, dressed in robes of the deepest black, moved with a practiced grace, their faces somber masks of grief. But a keen observer, as Edward had become under Kevin's guidance, would have seen the calculating glances and the almost imperceptible shifts in loyalty among the nobles. The passing of a king, even a beloved one, was always a moment of opportunity for the ambitious. Edward walked at the head of the procession, his mother, the queen, by his side. She was a vision of elegant, tearless grief. The weight of the royal orb felt like a stone in his hand, a burden far heavier than any he had ever carried. The funeral itself was a long, ritualized affair, a litany of prayers and praises for a man he had never truly known. He listened to the priest speak of his father's piety and courage, but the words felt hollow. The man they described was a stranger to the boy who had once longed for a single moment of attention, only to have his offering of a small, carved horse so carelessly dismissed. After the funeral, a great feast was held in the Hall of Valor. The hall, usually a place of joyous celebration, was now draped in black banners and funereal wreaths. The air, thick with the scent of roasted meat and mulled wine, was heavy with a forced solemnity. As the new king, Edward was seated on the throne, a high, cold chair of carved oak and gilded iron. The crown, a heavy circle of gold and jewels, felt like a shackle on his head. He watched the courtiers, their whispers like the buzzing of flies, their movements a dance of false sympathy and veiled ambition. His mind reeled from the loss, the suddenness of it all, and the crushing expectation that now settled upon him. He ate very little and spoke even less, answering questions from nobles with quiet, monosyllabic words. He felt a desperate urge to flee the hall, to return to the quiet, simple life he had shared with Kevin, a life where honesty was a virtue and friendship was a tangible thing. As the night wore on and the feast began to wind down, Edward made his quiet escape. He retired to his chambers, which had been his father's, feeling like an intruder in a museum of a man's life. Everything was a testament to his father's power: the heavy oak bed, the massive writing desk, the suits of armor in the corners. The sheer scale of it all was suffocating. He approached the nightstand beside the king's bed, a small, unassuming piece of furniture in a room filled with grandeur. It was there, amidst a small collection of books on military strategy, that he found it. A hidden drawer, so small it was almost invisible, and inside, a single, aged key and a folded piece of parchment. He opened the parchment. It was a note, written in an old, archaic script that he could not decipher. But at the bottom, in his grandfather's familiar hand, were 3 words scrawled in their common tongue: "My old chest." The words, stark and simple, sent a shiver down his spine. His mind, accustomed to puzzles from his years of reading and his hours with Kevin, began to work. He understood instantly that his grandfather, a man he had never known, had left a message for a future king, one his father had apparently never found. The fact that the note was in his grandfather's hand, a man who had been a figure of myth in his family, made the discovery feel all the more significant. Edward's mind immediately went to the chest. He knew his grandfather had lived in this castle and that some of his possessions remained. His father had kept very little of his own father's things, a choice Edward had always found odd. He began his search in the wardrobe, a vast room of cedar and linen that smelled of his father's unique, stern scent. He moved aside heavy velvet robes and silk tunics, searching for anything that resembled a chest. He found it behind a hanging of his father's old battle armor, a chest of dark, polished wood, bound with iron bands. It was ancient and beautiful, and the small key fit perfectly into the lock. With a click, the lock sprang open. Edward's heart hammered in his chest. He pulled the lid up, his imagination running wild with what he might find. Perhaps a great treasure, a weapon of legendary power, or a book of his grandfather's secrets. But the chest was empty. It contained nothing but the lingering scent of old dust and time. A wave of sorrow and profound disappointment washed over him. His father, a man who had always valued only what was practical and useful, had apparently deemed his own father's legacy to be worthless. Edward felt a sudden, hot surge of anger. His father had kept this chest, only to let it sit in an empty state, forgotten, a symbol of a legacy he did not care to understand. In a moment of pure, unadulterated rage, a sudden, powerful frustration at his father's coldness and his own loneliness, he threw the chest against the wall. It hit the solid stone with a deafening crack. A small, hidden drawer, no bigger than his hand, sprung open from the side of the chest that hit the wall. A shiny key and a folded map lay nestled inside, the light from the torch casting a glint of gold upon them. The map was drawn on a piece of thick, weathered parchment. It was a simple drawing of the castle grounds, the surrounding forest, and the path that led to the western valley. A red X was marked at the location of the old ruins he had passed on his way to Kevin's cottage. A small note, again in his grandfather's hand, was scribbled on the side of the map: "The path to wisdom lies beyond the old gates, where the stones watch and listen. Only my heir can enter." The words filled Edward with a strange combination of fear and exhilaration. His grandfather had not just left him an inheritance, he had left him a quest. He knew he could not face this alone. His first instinct was to seek out the one person he could trust implicitly, the one man who understood the unseen world. He mounted his horse, the map clutched in his hand, and rode through the moonless night to Kevin's cottage. He burst through the door, his chest heaving, his face a mixture of wild excitement and terrified wonder. "Master Kevin," he said, his voice a strained whisper. "My father, he is gone. But I have found something, a secret." He unrolled the map and laid it out on Kevin's table, the two of them leaning over it in the dim, flickering light of a single candle. He told Kevin of the king's passing, of the funeral and the feast, and of his discovery of the hidden chest and the map. Kevin listened in silence, his ancient face an unreadable mask, but Edward could see the deep wisdom in his eyes. "This," Kevin said, his voice a low rumble. "This is a key to your destiny, my boy. A king of men and a king of crowns. Your grandfather saw what your father could not. He knew his heir would need more than a simple throne to guide the kingdom." He looked at Edward, his expression now one of profound earnestness. "What do you want to do?" "I want to follow the map," Edward said, his voice firm. "I want to understand what this is. I want to know who my grandfather was, and I want to know why he left me this message. But I want it to be a secret. Only you and I are to know about this. I will tell the court that I am going on a hunting trip to clear my mind. I need you to guide me and stand guard." Kevin nodded in agreement, a slight smile on his lips. "The forest can be a dangerous place, my boy. But you are no longer just a prince. You are a king of your own heart. I will stand guard. I will watch the path, but this is a journey you must make alone. This is not for a prince. This is for a king." They set out at dawn, just as a thin mist was lifting from the forest floor. The journey to the ruins was swift and silent. They passed the familiar landmarks he had traversed so often with Kevin, the ancient, silent trees of the Whispering Woods, the babbling brook that cut through the landscape, and the great boulder known as the Guardian's Stone. With the map in his hand, Edward felt as though he was walking a path laid out for him centuries ago. They arrived at the ruins, which looked exactly as he remembered them, a few crumbling stone columns and the outline of an ancient courtyard. "The map shows a path leading around the side of the ruins," Edward said, his voice low. "The path to a back room." They circled the ruins, following a faint, overgrown trail. He saw a small opening, where a pile of rocks had been carefully stacked to conceal the entrance to a dark passageway. It was almost invisible to an untrained eye. "I will wait for you here, my boy," Kevin said, his voice a low whisper. "I will stand guard. No one will get in or out without my knowing. Go." Edward nodded and entered the passageway, the air growing colder and damper with every step. The passage was narrow, forcing him to turn sideways to get through it. He emerged into a small, torchlit room. The room was round and small, its walls lined with intricate, beautiful carvings. In the center of the room, a magnificent stone well was illuminated by a grayish-blue light. On either side of the well stood two life-sized statues of gargoyles, their wings folded, their expressions stern. At the base of the gargoyles were two names etched into the stone, one on the right and one on the left. On the right, Alastair. On the left, Eleonora. They were his grandparents, the grandfather he had never known and the grandmother he had only heard whispers of. Edward moved closer, his heart in his throat. He admired the carvings. The gargoyles were so lifelike that it was easy to forget that they were made of stone. He touched his grandfather's name. The stone was cold and smooth beneath his fingertips, a strange sensation that made him feel connected to a past he never knew. He looked into the well. The water was a luminescent, almost glowing liquid, with a beautiful grayish-blue light that emanated from the center of the fountain. It drew him in with an almost hypnotic pull, and he felt an overwhelming, ancient temptation to drink it. He knelt, his hand trembling, and cupped a bit of the glowing liquid. It was cool and smooth against his lips, and he drank. Nothing happened at first. He felt no change, no sudden rush of power or knowledge. He was still just Edward, the lonely prince and the reluctant king, standing in the presence of his ancestors. He looked at the gargoyles and then back at the fountain, a deep sadness settling in his heart. It was just a fountain. It was just a trick. His father had been right all along. The legacy was nothing. He stood up, and his shoulders slumped in defeat. He had journeyed to the place of his destiny, a place his grandfather had set aside for him, and had found nothing. He walked back to the entrance, his heart heavier than the crown he now wore. When he emerged into the cool air of the forest, Kevin was waiting. The old sage's face was an unreadable mask. "What did you find?" Kevin asked, his voice a low rumble. "What secrets did your ancestors leave for you?" Edward shook his head, a single, bitter tear running down his cheek. "Nothing, Master Kevin. Just an empty well and a few old statues." It was a fool's errand. He did not mention the strange sensation on his lips, or the hypnotic pull of the liquid, for fear that his mentor would see his profound disappointment. Kevin looked at him for a long moment, a gaze so intense it felt as though he could see right into his soul. "The path to wisdom is not always a straight one, my boy. Sometimes, the greatest lessons are hidden in the places we least expect them. Your journey is far from over." But Edward was too consumed by his sadness to hear the profound wisdom in his mentor's words. He simply nodded and headed back to his horse, leaving the ruins behind. Chapter 5, The Gift of Stone. Edward stumbled into his chambers, the disappointment of his journey to the ruins a heavy weight on his shoulders. The grand room, once a place of quiet refuge, now felt like a prison. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, and a lone lamp cast a dim, mournful light on the polished stone floor. He stripped off his ceremonial robes, tossing them onto a nearby chair. They felt like a costume, a grand disguise for a king who, in his heart, felt nothing but a profound emptiness. He was no longer just the lonely prince, but the new, and equally lonely, king. He had put his hope in a fairy tale, a magical well and a secret legacy, and had found only dust. With a heavy sigh, he extinguished the lamp and climbed into his massive, cold bed, the silence of the room swallowing him whole. He closed his eyes, his mind replaying the day's events, until exhaustion pulled him into a deep, dreamless sleep. But his sleep was not without its visitors. A presence entered his dreams, a figure he knew but did not know. The man was a shadow, a silhouette of a figure he had seen in the royal portraits of his ancestors, his grandfather. The man's form was shifting, blurring, his human shape twisting into a stone creature with wings folded behind him. He looked like the gargoyles from the fountain, but his eyes glowed with a kind, ancient light. He gestured, not with his hands, but with a simple nod of his head, towards the crumpled piece of parchment Edward had carried back from the ruins. "The key lies within you," his grandfather's silent voice echoed in his mind, clear as the ringing of a bell. "You must never tell anyone of your new gift. To be a great king, you must become the man I wanted your father to be." The stone creature then turned and flew through the window, not as a graceful bird, but like a shadow, a whisper of darkness on the wind. Edward woke with a panicked gasp, his body drenched in a cold sweat. His heart hammered against his ribs like a caged beast. He sat up, his eyes wide, the dream so vivid it felt like a memory. The air in the chamber was cold, and he felt a sharp wind blowing from the direction of the window. He looked over to see the heavy curtains billowing inwards, the long, embroidered material dancing widely in the gusty wind. A single window, which he was certain he had closed, was now open, the glass rattling in its frame. A sudden dread washed over him. He had never seen the window open on its own before. It was an impossible thing. He pushed himself out of the bed, his mind a confused haze. He took a hesitant step toward the window to close it, but a sudden, excruciating pain ripped through his body. It felt like 1,000 tiny needles piercing his skin, and then, a slow, deep, burning ache. The pain was not just on the surface, it felt as though it was deep in his very bones, as though his blood was boiling and his muscles were hardening. He cried out, a sound that was a mix of terror and agony, but the sound was choked off in his throat. His body felt heavy, impossibly so, as if he was being crushed under the weight of a mountain. He stumbled forward, a hand outstretched, and his fingers brushed against the polished surface of the mirror on the wall. He recoiled from the sight. The arm reflected in the glass was no longer his own. His skin, once soft and fair, had turned to a rough, greyish stone, the color of granite. His fingernails had been replaced by sharp, curved claws, and a thick, ridged plating of stone had begun to cover his skin. As he watched in horror, the transformation continued. From his back, two immense, stony shapes pushed through his nightshirt, tearing the fabric, unfurling themselves into a pair of immense, leathery wings. He was a monster, a creature of myth and legend. A gargoyle. Panic seized him. He tried to scream, to call for the guards, to summon his mother, but he could not. His throat, his mouth, his tongue, they were all turning to stone. The transformation was complete. He was trapped inside a statue. He was a prisoner in his own body, his vision now filtered through a pair of unblinking, stony eyes. He could still see everything, but he could not move. The dread and fear were all-consuming. His mind raced, a torrent of terrified thoughts, but his body was a silent, unmoving tomb. His limbs, once so supple and strong, felt as though they had been cast from a single, unyielding block of marble. He was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up, unable to escape. He could hear a faint, almost imperceptible sound from outside the castle walls, a sound so far away it was almost a whisper, the quiet exchange between two guards standing sentry on the outer wall, hundreds of yards away. "Quiet night, isn't it?" one of them said. "Almost too quiet." He could hear it with a clarity that was impossible for a human ear. Then he heard another sound, fainter still, from the adjoining chambers. A quiet, heart-wrenching sob. It was his mother, still weeping in her bed for her lost king. A new sense began to form, a strange awareness of his surroundings. He could feel the cold of the stone floor through his newly hardened body. He could feel the shifting air currents outside, the vibration of a carriage miles away, the subtle tremor of the earth beneath the castle. It was as if his senses were no longer bound by flesh, but connected to the very fabric of the world around him. He began to calm, a quiet surrender spreading through him. As his terror subsided, as his racing mind slowed, he felt a strange, subtle shift in his being. He focused on the peaceful image of Kevin in his mind, and the calming words of his mentor. He held on to that feeling, that sense of peace and stillness. As his emotions settled, the stone on his body began to recede. The color drained from his skin, the rough, stone-like texture softened, and the claws retracted. The wings on his back folded, melting away as if they had never been there. He was back to himself. He stared at his reflection, his mind reeling. The change was not permanent. It was tied to his emotions. The more chaotic and afraid he became, the more the stone consumed him. The more he controlled his fear, the more he returned to his human form. The realization settled over him with the weight of 1,000 secrets. He remembered his grandfather's words in the dream, the gift he was to receive. The words he had not understood on the note were now clear as day. He looked at the crumpled parchment on the floor. It was a letter, a message from his grandfather, and the words now held no mystery. "If you are reading this," the note began, "you have found and drank from the well. You are now a gargoyle and have superpowers. You can fly in stone form, your strength is beyond any, your toughness is beyond any. We have always been watching, waiting for a worthy king to find this. Keep our legacy secret but keep the kingdom safe, and remember your true gift is to do good." Tears streamed down his face, a mixture of both sadness and a strange, quiet wonder. A single stone tear, solidified and grey, fell from his eye and landed on the floor with a small, quiet clink before melting back into a normal tear. The absurdity of it all struck him, and he let out a choked chuckle, the sound catching in his throat. He had a secret. A terrible, wonderful, terrifying secret that was now his to keep. He found himself wandering the castle halls, his mind still in a daze, until he came upon his mother's chambers. He found her, as he had heard in his stone form, weeping softly. She looked up, her eyes red and puffy, and motioned for him to sit with her. He asked her about her memories of his grandfather, a man he had never been able to ask about before. She thought for a moment, her tearful gaze distant. "I only remember him as a very young stable girl," she said, her voice a soft, distant memory. "There was a fire, a terrible fire in the stables. I was trapped inside. I was sure I was going to die. But then, an angel of light came through the flames and wrapped his wings around me and carried me out. He never got burned, not a single scorch mark. He felt like an angel. A kind angel, with a strength that was beyond any man I'd ever seen." She looked at Edward, her face filled with wonder and a deep gratitude. "I never saw him again. But I will never forget how he saved me. I always believed it was your grandfather." Edward said nothing, the words settling in his heart. His grandfather had used the very same power he now possessed to protect his mother. The legacy he had found was not a curse, but a gift. He promised himself in that moment that he would keep his gift a secret, just as his grandfather had. Later that day, Edward met with a council of nobles. They were a circle of ambitious, powerful men who had been his father's closest advisors. They treated him with a cold formality, their eyes a study in speculation and doubt. They began to inform him of the affairs of the kingdom, the brewing conflicts with the neighboring kingdoms, the delicate trade agreements that his father had been working on, the state of the treasury. It was clear they saw him as a boy who was out of his depth, a king who needed to be guided and controlled. They spoke of the kingdom as a game of chess, a series of moves and counter-moves. But Edward listened with a new perspective, one that came from his time with Kevin and his new, strange gift. He saw not just the maps and the ledgers, but the people behind them, the soldiers who would die, the merchants who would starve. The gift of stone had not just given him power, it had given him a profound sense of responsibility. He would rule with a stone heart, but with a king's heart for his people. The council's whispers of discontent and their veiled doubts did not bother him. He was a king now. And he had a secret. Chapter 6, A Legacy Revealed. Edward, a ghost in his own castle, could not shake the feeling of profound emptiness. The crown felt like a mockery, a symbol of a power he was too young and too inexperienced to wield. The knowledge of his stone form was a strange, silent burden, and the council's condescending lectures filled him with a bitter resentment. He had to go back. The answer he craved was not in the castle's cold stone, but in the ruins he had so foolishly abandoned. He had to know why the well and the gargoyles had chosen him, and what secrets they truly held. He waited for the moonless night to return, for the cover of darkness to become his ally once more. He told the guards he was going on a personal pilgrimage to pray for his father's soul, a lie that was half a truth. He rode through the familiar forest, the air cool and silent, until he reached the overgrown stone entrance. Kevin was there, waiting. The old sage saw the determination in Edward's eyes and said nothing, a silent understanding passing between them. Edward entered the narrow passageway, the air growing colder with every step, until he emerged into the circular room where the fountain glowed. He approached it, his heart pounding in his chest, but this time, he looked at the carvings on the wall, not the well. The walls, which had seemed blank before, now shimmered faintly with a soft, otherworldly light. Words, previously invisible, were now clear. They glowed with a faint luminescence, an ancient script that shimmered on the stone. He touched them, and the words flowed into his mind, clear and true. They read, "The ancient halls here lay the answers within." He looked to his grandparents, the two great gargoyles standing in silent vigil. As he watched, the stone softened, the color shifted, and the rough, stony exterior melted away, revealing the human forms of his grandparents, Alastair and Eleonora, standing young and vibrant as they had in their portraits. Edward was speechless. He could only stare in a mixture of awe and fear. Alastair, his grandfather, a man he had only known through dusty paintings and a single, cryptic note, smiled with a warm, knowing light in his eyes. "You have many questions for us, Edward," he said, his voice the same kind rumble Edward had heard in his dream. "I have been watching over you and the kingdom for centuries. Your father never found the treasure because he never looked beyond his own ambition. He saw only what was tangible and did not look for the magic and wisdom that lies within the heart." They sat on the cold stone floor for hours, the fountain's soft glow illuminating their faces. Alastair spoke of the legacy of their family, a secret duty passed from one worthy heir to the next. He told Edward of his own life, of his rule for over 200 years, and of how he had to fake his own death and hide away when people began to question his lack of age. He taught Edward how to control his transformation, a process governed by his emotions, and how to harness his new strength and speed. He spoke of the gargoyles' true purpose, to be the silent guardians of the kingdom, the protectors of a legacy that was both a blessing and a burden. He said they were to be the unseen defenders of the royal line, and of the kingdom itself. He explained that their gift was tied to the well, a source of power that would regenerate their strength and youth for 100 years, before a new heir would be chosen to take over the mantle. Eleonora, Edward's grandmother, spoke of the secrets of the land. She told him of buried treasures and forgotten artifacts, treasures not of gold, but of ancient knowledge. She told him of other creatures that existed in the world, vampires, werewolves, ogres, and giants, creatures he had only ever read about in dusty tomes of myth and lore. She explained that their family's duty was to be the guardians of the mortal realm, to protect the delicate balance of life from those who would disrupt it. The cycle of life will be protected forever, she said, her voice a soft, beautiful melody. We are only here when the family is in need of our guidance, and to protect the kingdom from those who would disrupt our lineage. You, Edward, are now the guardian of a sacred trust. When the first light of dawn began to creep into the room, the glowing messages faded, and the human forms of his grandparents began to shimmer and fade back into the stone. They told him their time was up, and with a final, loving look, they became the statues he had found so long ago. Edward, now full of a newfound wisdom, calmly took a handful of the rocks from outside the cave and reset the entrance so no one could find it again. He was not the boy who had come here filled with sorrow, he was a king, with a sacred duty, and he knew what he had to do. He rode back to the castle with a light heart, his mind filled with a quiet resolve. He went to his mother and told her everything he had found, not about his gift, but about his conversation with Kevin and about the importance of her grief. He sat with her for hours, holding her hand, listening to her, and giving her a space to heal. He helped her come to a sense of peace with his father's passing, a peace that was both a relief and a comfort. When he met with the council again, he was no longer a boy to be controlled. He walked with a new authority. He brought up the Treaty of Westmill Castle, a long-stalled peace agreement that his father had worked on for years. The council was surprised by his renewed sense of purpose. He told them he was going to finalize the treaty himself and bring it to a close. They advised him against it, saying it was too dangerous to go to the enemy's kingdom without a full army, but Edward was unyielding. He had a gift far more powerful than any army, and he knew he could handle whatever came his way. He told them he would bring a companion with him. The council balked at the idea of a king taking a companion, but Edward stood his ground, reminding them he was the king now, and what he said went. They agreed to his terms. Edward's companion would be Kevin, the only man he trusted with his life, the only man who knew the truth of his being. He would not travel alone. Chapter 7, The Treaty of Westmill. The ride to Westmill Castle was a quiet one, a journey through a land scarred by 2 decades of animosity. Edward rode at the head of their small party, his gaze sweeping across the landscape that had so often been a battlefield in the minds of his father's generals. The trees were thin and sparse, a sign of the land's exhaustion from a long-standing feud. The roads were little more than dirt paths, a testament to how long the 2 kingdoms had been separated by a wall of mistrust and bitterness. Kevin rode silently by his side, the old sage a tower of strength and quiet reassurance. The presence of the king and his lone companion, a figure of myth and legend in his own right, seemed to create a quiet field of power around them. The journey, which would have taken a full company of guards' days, they completed in 2. It was a testament to Edward's newfound resolve and the unyielding strength he now carried. The sun, a burning disk of gold in the sky, was beginning its descent as the high stone walls of Westmill Castle appeared on the horizon. The castle, carved from the same dark stone as the mountains it was built upon, was a fortress of grim beauty. Its towers were sharp spires, and its walls seemed to have 1,000 eyes, watching, waiting for the return of war. As they approached the main gates, a single horn sounded from the high battlements. The sound was sharp and commanding, a warning to all who dared approach. From the castle walls, a volley of arrows appeared, their sharp points aimed directly at the 2 of them. They did not fly, but stood poised, a threat held in a moment of tense stillness. At the top of the wall, a man with a beard the color of salt and pepper appeared, his face a mask of grim determination. It was King Servan. "You are either brave or you have a death wish," he shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls, a sound of bitter power. "What brings you to my castle, young man?" Edward, with a calm that astonished even himself, unrolled the parchment he carried and held it high above his head. He knew his father's version of the treaty was an ultimatum, a declaration of war. But he had been up all night, rewriting it, changing every word of hostility into a promise of peace. He had replaced demands with offers, threats with a hand extended in friendship. He looked up at King Servan, and his voice, though not loud, carried the weight of his new power. "I am not my father," he shouted, his voice a clear, ringing sound that felt as though it was a part of the wind itself. I know the struggles you hold within your castle. I do not wish to war with you. I wish to bring peace to the land and to help it grow as a unity. He continued to speak, his words flowing from him like a river. If I could only speak a moment of your time, he called out, his voice filled with an earnest plea for understanding. King Servan looked at the two of them, his gaze sweeping from Edward's earnest face to Kevin's silent, powerful presence. He saw no greed in the young king's eyes, no lust for power, only a profound sense of sincerity. He gave a sharp signal to his guards, and the arrows were lowered. The main gate swung open, a slow, deliberate movement of heavy iron and thick wood. King Servan came out, flanked by two guards, his hand on the hilt of his sword. He approached Edward, his gaze never leaving his face. He looked at the young man before him, not as a symbol of a kingdom he hated, but as a person. The air between them, once so thick with tension, began to feel lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. Edward handed him the treaty, and King Servan, with a single nod, motioned for them to enter. They sat in the great hall of Westmill Castle, the light of the sun pouring through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. King Servan read the treaty, his face a mask of profound surprise. He read and reread every word, every promise of friendship and collaboration. Your father, he said, his voice a low, hard whisper, he wanted to take our lands. I know, Edward said, his voice soft but firm. I know the struggles you face here. My father was a man of ambition, but ambition is a dangerous path to walk without wisdom. We have enough. Our people are suffering under the weight of this endless conflict. It is time for it to end. He spoke of the shared resources, of how their forests had a great supply of timber, while the western lands had an abundance of live creatures, an overflowing of food that could sustain both of their people if they would only share. He spoke of his grandfather, a man whom King Servan remembered as a figure of great honor, a king who had always kept the peace. King Servan, seeing the sincere, open heart of the young king, made a decision. He looked into Edward's eyes, a look of profound respect and gratitude in his gaze. He shook Edward's hand, a strong, firm grasp of a man who had known a lifetime of struggle. They embraced, a simple, human gesture that sealed a peace treaty. The Council of Westmill, who had been listening from the shadows, looked on with a kind of stunned awe. The two men, a young king and an old one, had accomplished what a generation of diplomats had failed to do. The feud, which had been going on for 20 years, was over in a matter of hours. The news spread through the castle like wildfire, and a cheer erupted from the guards and the servants. The treaty was signed, and King Servan, with a smile on his face, called for a feast. The feast was a beautiful, joyous affair, a celebration not just of a treaty, but of a new era of peace. The hall was filled with music and laughter, and the nobles of both kingdoms sat together, sharing food and drink, their old grudges melting away in the warmth of the moment. Edward sat in the head of the table, his heart filled with a profound sense of accomplishment. He had done more for his people in a single day than his father had in a lifetime. As the feast wore on, he began to feel tired, the weight of the day and his emotions settling in. He excused himself, promising to return to the feast after a quick rest. He walked to his chambers, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He entered the room and closed the window to keep the sounds of the celebration at a normal level. He sat on the bed and began to meditate on his emotions, to calm his mind and regain his focus. As he closed his eyes, his mind began to quiet down, and with it, his senses began to expand. He could hear not just the sounds of the feast, but the distant, quiet conversations from the courtyard outside. He could hear the soft whisper of a horse's breath in the stable. He could hear the low, rumbling voice of King Servan, who was standing with one of his councilmen in the garden below. He was too far away for Edward to hear a normal conversation, but with his new gift, the words were as clear as if they were standing beside him. The nobleman was complaining about the feast, saying it was too soon. "We still have our troubles," he said. "The frost dragon in the West Mountains has been eating our livestock again. We can't afford to have a feast for two kingdoms when our people are facing starvation. It's too great a risk. We've lost too much." King Servan, his voice a quiet, firm sound, replied, "We have a treaty now. We have a king on our side who is not afraid of change. He is the first step towards a lasting peace, and we will get through this, even if it is with a dragon in the mountains. We cannot let a beast interfere with the balance of the land. He looked up, and Edward heard him with an impossible clarity. With this new king, and the power he has, he will protect us. This is the new beginning. Edward's heart, which had been so full of relief and hope, suddenly filled with a cold, determined fear. A frost dragon. A beast from the myths his grandmother had told him about. This was not a problem of diplomacy, but of survival. The next challenge for his kingdom, and for his people, was a beast of legends. He had his first true test as a king and a guardian. He knew in that moment he had to face the beast. This was not a job for an army, but for a gargoyle. This was his first true test as king and as a gargoyle. This was his first real mission. Chapter 8, The Frost Dragon of the West. The journey back to his kingdom was marked by a sense of calm accomplishment. The vast forest, once a place of quiet contemplation, now felt like a part of his new purpose. Edward and Kevin rode in comfortable silence, their hearts light with the success of their mission. As they approached the castle, the towers of the kingdom, once a sight that filled Edward with a sense of dread and confinement, now seemed to stand as a symbol of his new responsibility. The gates opened to a chorus of cheers, and the guards looked on with a kind of stunned awe at their young king, who had left a boy and returned a man. Edward went directly to his mother. He found her in her private chambers, her face still marked with the grief of her loss. He told her everything, leaving out his new gift, of course, and spoke of the peace treaty he had secured. He spoke not just of the strategic importance of the treaty, but of the people it would help, of the lives it would save. His words were not just those of a king but of a son, a man who had found his purpose in the face of immense tragedy. The quiet strength in his voice and the new wisdom in his eyes were all the reassurance his mother needed. She smiled, a soft, beautiful expression that Edward had not seen since his father's passing. He then sought out Kevin. He found the old man in the armory, polishing his ancient sword. "I cannot thank you enough," Edward said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You have been my mentor, my friend, and my guide. You have always been there for me, even when I did not know I needed you." He then offered Kevin a new chamber in the castle, a room that was 3 times the size of the small cot he had slept on in the old studio. It was a grand room with high windows and a view of the mountains. Kevin, his face a mask of profound humility, accepted the offer. The next day, Edward met with the council, who were astonished at the news. The ancient feud that had defined a generation was over. They had planned to deal with Westmill Castle with an army and an ultimatum, but Edward, with only a trusted companion, had brought them peace. They were pleased with the result and agreed to hold a peace feast to celebrate with the nobles from both kingdoms. Edward, however, was preoccupied. He had a new problem, a new secret, a new mission, and this one was not for the public. It was for a king, and for a gargoyle. That night, after the sun had set and the castle was quiet, Edward left his chambers. He returned to the ruins, the place where his journey had truly begun. The glowing messages on the walls were now invisible. The fountain was still, but the gargoyle statues of his grandparents were a source of comfort to him. He knelt before them. "There is a frost dragon in the mountains," he said, his voice a low, rumbling whisper. "A beast that is eating the livestock and causing a problem for Westmill. How can I fight a beast of such a mythic scale?" The 2 gargoyle statues, his grandparents, seemed to glow from within, and a faint whisper came from his grandfather. "Speak to the elder frost dragon. There is something odd about it, since most dragons stay in their cave and wait for food to come to them. There is a reason it is leaving its home to hunt." Edward nodded, a new kind of resolve filling him. This was not a battle to be won with a sword or a council meeting, but with wisdom and with his new power. He stood up, and with a deep breath, he let go of his human form, a change that was now as natural as breathing. The stone hardened, the claws sprouted, and his great stone wings unfurled from his back with a soft, grinding sound of shifting rock. He took a single step, and with a great push, he launched himself into the night sky, his massive wings carrying him towards the west. He flew for hours, a dark shape against the moonless sky, until he saw the jagged peaks of the western mountains. As he flew over the mountains, he could see the telltale signs of the dragon below him. The trees were broken, their branches bent and twisted as if something massive had moved through them. He could see a trail of frosty mist rising from the trees, a sign of the dragon's presence. He swooped down, a silent, grey shadow in the night, until he landed on a high rock overlooking a clearing. He shifted back to his human form, a process that felt as though he was shedding a heavy coat. The change was no longer painful, but a part of him. He looked out into the clearing and saw the great beast, its scales the color of ice, its body coiled in a resting position. He saw the remains of 2 bears at its feet, a sign of its recent meal. Edward walked towards the dragon, his footsteps a quiet crunch in the frosty air. The dragon's head, which was the size of a small house, turned to him with a slow, deliberate movement. Its eyes, the color of a winter sky, narrowed. The dragon let out a frosty snort, a cloud of frozen vapor blowing from its nostrils, and its deep voice, a low rumble that felt as though it was coming from the very earth itself, spoke. "What is it that you seek, Gargoyle?" Edward was shocked. Not only had a mythical beast spoken to him, but it knew what he was. He took a moment to recover his composure, his mind a whirlwind of questions and new realities. He spoke. "I am King Edward, and I seek to know why you are hunting outside of your cave, when your kind is known to stay in their homes." The dragon sighed, a long, drawn-out sound that sent a shiver through the trees. "There is a problem with my cave," the dragon said, a sadness in its deep voice. "There is a blood ritual. A sorcerer. He is corrupting my home with evil spirits. I cannot stay there, and I cannot rest. I am forced to leave and hunt, to feed, to survive." Edward's mind raced, connecting the dots. His grandfather's warning, the dragon's strange behavior. It all made sense. The dragon was not a monster to be slain, but a victim of an evil sorcerer. "Stand put," Edward said, his voice filled with a new authority. "I will return. I promise I will clear your cave. Wait for me here." Without another word, Edward became a stone gargoyle once more and launched himself into the sky, his powerful wings carrying him towards the dragon's cave. He found the cave easily, the air growing colder with every step, the air around it filled with a chilling, malevolent energy. Inside, a sorcerer stood in the middle of a ritual circle, his hands raised, a ruby necklace glowing a deep, angry red around his neck. He was in the middle of a blood spell, his voice a low, evil chant. The sorcerer, sensing a presence, looked up and saw the great gargoyle. He had only a moment to react. He threw a poisonous dagger at Edward, but it bounced off the stone gargoyle's head with a loud spark, falling to the ground with a soft ting. Edward landed silently behind the sorcerer, his powerful hand wrapping around the man's throat. Edward, with a single, swift motion, ripped the man's spine from his torso. As the sorcerer's body fell, Edward grabbed the glowing ruby necklace and crushed it into dust, the evil spirits that had filled the cave dissolving back into the air. The cave, once a place of evil and cold, grew silent again, filled with warmth and comfort. Edward returned to the dragon, who had been waiting for him. He told the great beast everything that had happened, of the sorcerer and the necklace and the cave that was now free of the evil spirits. The dragon's eyes, filled with a deep, ancient gratitude, looked upon him. "Thank you, young gargoyle," the dragon said. "You have done a great service to me and to your kingdom. I will not leave my cave again." He then turned and flew towards his cave, a low, rumbling chuckle shaking the ground. "Thanks for leaving me desert, young one." Edward, tired and bruised, returned to his chambers, his heart filled with a profound sense of accomplishment. He had not just acted as a king, but as a protector, a guardian of his people and of the land itself. He had his first real taste of his new life, and he had done well. He fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, a sleep of a king who knew his true purpose. Chapter 9, The Golden Kingdom, A Last Goodbye. For Edward, the years that followed seemed to pass in a blur. The next 10 years were a decade of peace and prosperity. The kingdom flourished under his rule. He was no longer the boy who had fled his duties, but a king who had found his purpose in protecting his people and his lands. He built new roads, expanded the kingdom's trade routes, and strengthened the bonds between his kingdom and the neighboring territories. His days were filled with council meetings, with decrees and with the small, quiet joys of a life well lived. The once dreaded responsibilities now felt like second nature to him, and the 10 years felt as though they had passed in a single, peaceful day. One day, as was his custom, he decided to take a break from the drudgery of paperwork and went fishing in the verdant Eastvale forest. The air was cool and crisp, the sun dappling through the thick canopy of leaves. He sat on the bank of a winding river, the gentle lapping of the water against the rocks a soothing rhythm. He cast his line and waited, a quiet smile on his face. This was the life he had fought for, the peace he had earned. Suddenly, a strange rumbling sound echoed through the forest. It was a low, mournful sound, like the groaning of ancient trees. The leaves on the branches seemed to whisper to each other in a collective gasp of sorrow. A chill went down Edward's spine. He looked up, his eyes scanning the horizon, and saw in the distance a plume of smoke, a fiery orange glow rising above the tree line. The sight of it sent a wave of alarm through him. He had seen fire before, but never on this scale. The trees in the distant forest were ablaze, and the fire was spreading with a terrifying speed. He could see the wind carrying embers and smoke, and the very air seemed to smell of burning wood and sorrow. He reeled in his line, his heart pounding in his chest. The peaceful day was over. The king's respite was done. He raced back to his castle, the gentle fishing rod in his hand feeling foreign and useless. He arrived at the courtyard, his guards and council members looking on with worried expressions. The news had already reached them. The smoke was a dark smudge on the clear sky, a grim warning of a new threat. Edward, without a moment's hesitation, gathered a team of his most experienced soldiers. "We must find the source of this fire," he commanded, his voice filled with a new, authoritative urgency. "And we must put a stop to it." The group, a small but formidable force, rode to the outskirts of the burning area. The heat was immense, the air thick with smoke and the roar of the flames. The sight before them was one of pure devastation. The once beautiful Eastvale forest was now a sea of fire and ash. They moved along the perimeter of the blaze, their eyes searching for a clue, a sign of what could cause such a catastrophe. They found their answer at the edge of the fire. A group of orcs, grotesque creatures with tusks and green skin, were pouring oil on the trees and lighting them on fire. There were about 15 of them, their brutish faces lit by the firelight, a malevolent gleam in their eyes. Edward's heart sank. He had never seen orcs before, but the stories of their cruelty were legendary. He looked at his soldiers, and then back at the orcs. He had 45 soldiers, and they had a clear advantage. The odds were looking good. As his men prepared for battle, Edward's eyes caught a glimpse of something in the heart of the inferno. A cargo cart, half consumed by the flames, sat in the middle of the fire. And on it, a body, burned to a crisp, its form barely recognizable. A wave of fury washed over him, a cold, hard anger that he had not felt since the day of his father's funeral. These orcs were not just vandals, they were murderers. They had to be stopped. He gave the order to attack. Crossbows were fired in a volley, their arrows finding their marks with deadly precision. The orcs, caught off guard, roared in surprise and anger. They pulled out their crude swords and charged, but they were no match for the trained soldiers. A fierce battle ensued, the clash of steel and the shouts of men and orcs filling the air. The orcs fought with a savage ferocity, killing 4 of Edward's guards before they finally perished, their bodies falling to the ground with a final, ugly thud. The battle was over, but the war was just beginning. The fire was growing, a monstrous thing that was devouring the forest with an insatiable hunger. They couldn't fight it, not with the limited resources they had. They were unprepared, and the thought of losing the Eastvale forest, of losing this beautiful, ancient place, filled Edward with a sense of dread. He made the difficult decision to retreat. They returned to the castle, their faces smudged with ash and soot, their hearts heavy with the news they carried. Edward consulted his council, and the scouts relayed the grim report of the fire. The council, ever the strategists, spoke of firebreaks and buckets, of the long, arduous process of putting out such a massive blaze. But Edward was not listening. He was thinking of the dragon. That night, under the cloak of darkness, the elder frost dragon emerged from its cave in the western mountains. It flew towards the Eastvale forest, a majestic, silver-blue shape against the dark night. No one knew why it had come, but its purpose was clear. It let out a single, powerful breath, a blast of icy air that was so cold it seemed to burn. The breath spread over the forest in a wide arc, a wave of frost that instantly extinguished the flames. The fiery orange glow of the fire was replaced by a pale, icy sheen. The ground froze, the burnt trees became covered in a layer of frost, and the very air turned to vapor. The dragon, its work done, turned back towards its cave. As it flew over the castle of Westmill, the king of Westmill, a man who had been a loyal friend to Edward for 10 years, looked up from his balcony. He saw the great dragon, a creature of myth and legend, a beast that had once terrorized his people, now flying over his castle with a purpose, with a mission. The king of Westmill, a man who had seen many strange things in his life, knew in his heart that he had just witnessed something truly remarkable. The next morning, news of the miraculous event reached Edward's castle. The guards were speaking in hushed tones, their eyes wide with awe. "Did you guys see that?" one of the guards was saying, his voice filled with wonder. "A dragon. It was a real dragon. It saved the Eastvale forest." The others nodded in agreement, their faces lit with a mix of fear and excitement. "What an amazing creature," another said. Edward, with a smile on his face, looked at his people. He saw the wonder in their eyes, the respect, the relief. "This calls for a feast," he declared, his voice filled with a royal decree. "A feast to celebrate our victory against the orcs, and to thank the great creature that saved our forest." The feast that night was a grand affair, a celebration of life and peace. The tables were laden with food and drink, and the music was filled with a joyful rhythm. Edward, however, was restless. His heart was heavy with a different kind of sadness. He had a premonition, a quiet dread that he could not shake. As the feast wound down, he slipped away from the revelry and headed to his mother's chambers. He found her sitting in a chair, her face a road map of a life well lived. She was older, her hair a silver halo around her head, her skin a soft parchment. She looked frail, a shadow of the strong, vibrant woman she had once been. Her eyes, however, were still filled with a quiet strength and a deep, abiding love. "Son, come in the room please," she said, her voice a whisper of what it used to be. "I am getting older. I am dying." Edward's heart clenched in his chest. He had known this day would come, but hearing it spoken aloud was a blow he was not prepared for. "I am so proud of the man you've become," she continued, her eyes welling up with tears. "My grandmother gave me this necklace. It was her father's. She said if I ever have a child, please pass this on to him. There is some sort of writing on it, but I never got to ask what it says before Grandma died. I want to pass it down to you now." She held out a small, delicate chain with a single, glowing stone. Edward took it, his hand trembling slightly. He looked at his mother's face, her eyes filled with a love that transcended time and life itself. He saw the lines of age, the wisdom of years, and the peaceful acceptance of her own end. "Don't give up, Mom," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You still have time left." His mother smiled and replied, "I will hold on as long as I can, son. I must rest now. Go enjoy the feast." The next day a messenger arrived from the kingdom in the east, a land known as the Golden Kingdom. It was a kingdom of immense wealth, with castles of gleaming gold and statues of polished bronze. The messenger brought a royal summons from their great king. He asked for King Edward to come and talk about the fire that had occurred in the Eastvale forest. He had heard of Edward's heroic act and asked for aid in repairing the walls of his city in exchange for some of their great wealth. The Golden Kingdom had always been a close ally to Edward's family. He remembered his father speaking of their king with great respect, of their castles and their people, of their wisdom and their kindness. He was excited to see the golden fountains and golden statues he had heard so much about. He arrived at the Golden Kingdom with a small entourage of guards, and was met with a grand feast. The air was filled with music and laughter, the tables laden with food and drink. The old king, a man with a kind face and eyes that held a lifetime of wisdom, introduced his family. And as Edward's eyes fell upon the princess, his breath caught in his throat. She was a vision of grace and beauty, her hair the color of spun gold, her eyes a deep, intelligent blue. He was immediately taken away by her. After the feast, as his guards were speaking with the king, Edward found himself with the princess in the castle courtyard. They walked in comfortable silence, their footsteps a quiet rhythm in the night. They spoke of life and future, of their dreams and their fears. Edward, who had never truly spoken to a woman like this before, found himself opening up to her, telling her of his new life, of the burdens he carried, of the gargoyle he had become. He did not tell her of his power, of course, but he spoke of the peace he had found and the purpose that had come with it. She listened, her eyes filled with a gentle understanding. He felt himself falling for her, a warm, new feeling in his heart that he had not felt before. He asked if they could visit each other more, a tentative question that she answered with a soft, beautiful smile. The king, as he walked by, saw his daughter laughing with Edward. He did not feel anger or jealousy, but a quiet happiness. His daughter had found someone who saw her not just as a princess, but as a person, and that meant more to him than anything. He was getting older, and he had been worried she would never find someone to love. Edward returned to his castle, his heart filled with a joyous new feeling. He went to his mother's chambers, his mind a whirlwind of new thoughts and emotions. He wanted to tell her everything, of the beautiful kingdom and the kind king, of the amazing lady he had met, who reminded him so much of her. He found her sitting in her chair, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. He took her hand, and she opened her eyes, a faint smile on her face. "I'm proud of you, son," she said, her voice a mere whisper. "I want you to be happy and know that I will love you always. And never forget your path in life." Edward told her that he loved her too, his voice choked with emotion. He knew these were the last moments with his dying mother. They hugged one last time, a final, poignant embrace, before she shut her eyes for good. As he stayed by his mother's side for an hour, he spoke, saying he would make her proud in this life. He then let the guards know, and they planned a funeral for her, a final goodbye for a queen and a mother who had lived a life of grace and courage. Edward stayed with her for an hour, holding her hand, telling her of his life, of the peace he had brought to the land, of the gargoyle he had become. He told her he loved her. As he spoke, he saw the light in her eyes fade, the strength in her hand weaken. He watched as his mother, his guide, his rock, closed her eyes for good. He stayed by her side for another hour, a single tear rolling down his cheek. He spoke to her, a soft promise in the quiet room. "I will make you proud in this life, Mom. I promise." He then let the guards know, and they planned a funeral for the queen, a final farewell for a woman who had lived a life of quiet grace. Final chapter, a king's legacy. The king's chambers, once a symbol of his father's unwavering strength and his mother's quiet grace, now felt like a mausoleum. For weeks, Edward had avoided this room. He had slept on a simple cot in his old bedroom, the place where he had spent his formative years. He had taken his meals in a small, private antechamber, preferring solitude to the grand, empty dining hall. But tonight was different. Tonight, a new, unsettling energy coursed through him, pulling him toward the room that had belonged to his parents. He had a feeling, a premonition, that something important awaited him there. He entered the king's chamber, his footsteps echoing on the polished wooden floor. The room was vast, dominated by a large four-poster bed draped in crimson and gold. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and his mother's favorite lavender. He walked to the center of the room, to the foot of the bed, and sat down on a velvet bench. He was home. He had moved his belongings here from his old room. A new era was dawning for the kingdom, and it had to begin with him. In his hand, he held the locket his mother had given him. It was a simple, elegant piece of jewelry, a single, glowing stone on a delicate chain. He had held it every night since he had returned from the Golden Kingdom, feeling the warmth of the stone against his skin and remembering the love in his mother's eyes. Tonight, however, the stone seemed to thrum with a faint, insistent light. The writing on it, a series of strange, intricate symbols, seemed to pulse with an energy he had never felt before. He had tried to read them, but they were not of any language he knew. They were ancient, mysterious, and they had always been a source of fascination for him. He knew what he had to do. Kevin was just in the next room, finishing up some paperwork for the day. Edward stood and walked briskly to the door, a sense of urgency propelling him forward. Kevin was a man whose wrinkles held the stories of 1,000 years, and his eyes, though clouded by age, held a deep intelligence. Edward greeted him and then led him back to the royal chambers, where he had laid the locket on a mahogany table. "Kevin," Edward said, his voice filled with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "My mother gave this to me. There are symbols on it. I have tried to read them, but I cannot. I need your help. Can you decipher them?" Kevin's eyes, full of curiosity, lit up. He walked over to the table and picked up the locket with a gentle, practiced hand. He turned it over and over, his fingers tracing the intricate carvings. A look of surprise and then recognition spread across his face. He squinted at the symbols, his lips moving as if he was reciting an ancient prayer. Then, with a gasp, he looked up at Edward, his eyes wide. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice a low, reverent whisper. "This is a very old dialect. It is a form of vampiric coding, a language that was used by the ancient beings who were said to have walked this land long before us. I have only ever read about it in old texts." He paused, his gaze fixed on the locket, as if he was seeing a ghost from a forgotten time. "I know this language. It is a language of secrets. The message reads, 'The secret lays beneath the castle to the west in a tomb we rest.'" Edward's heart pounded in his chest. "The castle to the west?" he asked, his mind racing. "There is an old, ruined castle just beyond Westmill Castle, isn't there? The one that fell during the Old War?" Kevin nodded slowly. "Yes. The one they say is haunted. The old people of this land speak of it in hushed tones." A sudden realization struck Edward. His mother had a small, private library just off the king's chambers. He had never been inside. He had always been told it was her private sanctuary, a place where she would retreat to read and reflect. He had not touched anything since she had passed, leaving everything exactly as it was. A new feeling coursed through him now. He had to go in there. He thanked Kevin for his wisdom and walked to the door of his mother's private library. He entered the library, the air still and quiet. The room was small, with shelves filled with books from floor to ceiling. He walked to the center of the room, his eyes scanning the shelves, looking for something, anything that might help him understand the locket and its message. He ran his fingers along the spines of the books, feeling the worn leather and the aged paper. He was about to give up when he noticed a small, leather-bound book tucked away in a corner of the shelf. It was not a book, but a series of handwritten papers bound together. The cover was faded and worn, and there was no title. He pulled it out and sat on a small wooden chair, his heart pounding in his chest. He opened the book and began to read. The handwriting was his grandmother's, and the papers told a terrible story. It was a story of a family of guardians who lived in the old, ruined castle to the west. A story of his great-grandfather, a brave warrior who was the last to stand against a family of vampires who had come to their land. The vampires, as the stories go, were not just a single family, but a whole clan of beings who could command the darkness itself. They were more powerful than anything they had ever faced, and they saw the guardians as little more than cattle. They tried to take over their land. The guardians of his great-grandfather's family fought them, but they were too strong. It was a brutal war, a war that they almost lost. Then, the great ancient beings, their ancestors, came. They were a family of protectors, with powers beyond their comprehension. They hunted the vampires, and they burned this old castle to the ground, a single, powerful act of defiance that drove the vampires away. They then retreated back to this castle, where they were said to have fallen into a deep slumber. The vampires, as the stories go, went into the tomb beneath the castle, where they still rest, awaiting the day they can once again rise to power. His grandmother had also written about her personal life after the battle. She spoke of her heartbreak over the death of her father, his great-grandfather, and her decision to leave the old castle and find a new life. She had migrated to Westmill Castle, a place she had only heard about in stories, where she had found a new life and a new love. She had met a stable man, a good and kind man who was a human, and they had fallen in love and had a daughter, Edward's mother. The old family, with its secrets and its history, was a part of him now, a part of his mother's blood, and a part of his own destiny. He sat there, lost in thought, the old papers in his hands, as the moon rose higher in the night sky. He was a guardian, a king, a man of peace, but now he was more. He was a protector. He was a protector of the realm, and he had a mission. He returned to his royal chambers, and sat at the foot of his bed, holding the locket, a single tear rolling down his cheek. He had a family now, a people to protect, and a family legacy to uphold. The locket, once a simple trinket, was now a powerful symbol of his destiny. He looked at the window as the moon, a pale, silvery disk, shone over the castle walls. The stars, a million points of light, seemed to twinkle with a newfound meaning. The old stories, the old legends, they were all connected. They were all a part of him. He looked at the moon as he drifted to rest. He wondered what else the ancient beings would have in store for him in the future. The path ahead was dark and mysterious, but he was no longer afraid. He was a king. He was a protector. He was a guardian. And he was home. To be continued.